Across 3 completely different Land Rover engines, built 4 decades apart, the same failure keeps repeating for the same reason. It is not the design, and it is not even mileage. It is one habit most owners quietly skip, right up until a warning light turns into a rebuilt engine and a 5-figure bill. These are the only 3 Land Rover engines with genuinely documented histories past 300,000 miles, and the one habit that decides which examples actually get there. 3. The TD5, proof that the habit matters more than the technology. Produced between 1998 and 2007, this 2.5-liter inline 5-turbo diesel powered the Defender and the 2nd generation Discovery, and it was the last diesel engine Land Rover ever developed fully in-house, loosely based on the earlier Rover L series design. Factory output sits around 122 horsepower and 221 pound-feet of torque, numbers a modern hatchback would beat without trying. I have looked at enough high-mileage TD5 records to say this confidently: the engine was never the weak link. The habit was. Before the TD5, Land Rover diesels ran on purely mechanical injection pumps. The TD5 replaced that with electronically controlled unit injectors, a genuine technological leap for the company at the time, and one that let owners remap the ECU for more power later, up to 150 to 180 horsepower on a good tune, without touching the internals. What Land Rover refused to change alongside that leap is the real story. The cast iron block, the naturally balanced 5-cylinder layout, the robust forged crankshaft and sturdy connecting rods, all of it carried straight over from the old mechanical diesels. There is a production detail worth knowing too. Early engines built before 2002 used a 10P cylinder head, while engines made after 2002 moved to an upgraded 15P head with better internal components. If you are shopping for one, that date matters as much as the number on the odometer. The bottom end has real headroom built into it. Specialist tuners regularly push remapped TD5 well past 300 horsepower for competition use, more than double the factory figure, and the block, crank, and connecting rods handle it without needing to be replaced. You do not attempt that on an engine with a genuinely weak bottom end, because a marginal design shows its limits the moment you ask more of it. It is a strong sign of exactly how conservatively this motor was engineered under the surface, and it is one reason so many of these engines are still on the road decades after the factory tune stopped being the point. Here is the habit that actually decides its lifespan. Independent Land Rover workshops in South Africa have documented TD5 Discovery still running fault-free past 183,000 miles on strict 6,000-mile service intervals, used for repeated long-distance trips into Botswana and Namibia with no roadside spares carried at all. Others report passing 174,000 miles with nothing beyond routine servicing, and forum records from expedition owners describe TD5 Defenders comfortably clearing 300,000 miles once properly maintained. Specialists who rebuild these engines for a living note that even average care, not the obsessive kind, is enough to comfortably clear 250,000 miles before anything internal needs attention. Every one of those examples shares the same pattern. Nobody let a small problem sit. The TD5's famous weak point proves the same rule. The injector wiring harness uses internal seals that degrade with age, letting engine oil seep into the harness and travel by capillary action into the ECU plug. Left alone, it eventually causes electrical faults. Caught early, it is an inexpensive harness replacement and a clean of the ECU connections. That is the entire difference between a minor service and a real problem, and it comes down to whether anyone was paying attention. The same logic applies to the smaller items nobody talks about: exhaust manifold studs that work loose over time, and a fine mesh fuel strainer that can clog if it is never checked. None of these are design flaws. Every single one of them is a 5-minute inspection that either happens or does not. The habit that matters most, though, is cooling. A cracked cylinder head from prolonged overheating is the one failure that genuinely ends a TD5 early, and it is almost always preventable with nothing more than watching the temperature gauge and topping up coolant before it becomes a problem instead of after. There is a mechanical reason the TD5 runs smoother than you would expect for a diesel of its era. An inline 5 splits the firing pulses more evenly across a rotation than a 4-cylinder can, which reduces the harshness that shakes bolts loose and fatigues mounts over hundreds of thousands of miles. Land Rover did not choose 5 cylinders for novelty. It paid off specifically in the kind of high mileage rough road use these vehicles were built for. Part support has aged unusually well for an engine that left production in 2007. Injectors, turbochargers, harnesses, and sensors remain widely available through independent specialists, which keeps high mileage examples worth saving instead of scrapping. Land Rover specified a service interval of 10,000 miles or 12 months, whichever comes first, and the owners who actually stick to that, oil, filter, and a proper look at the cooling system, are consistently the ones still driving these past 300,000 miles. If the TD5 proves that the habit outweighs the technology, the next engine removes half the habit's risk before it can even start. 2. The 300 TDI, the engine that shrinks the list of habits down to 1. Ask any Land Rover specialist which diesel they would trust on a trip with no backup plan, and this name comes up first almost every time. Introduced in March 1994 as a refinement of the earlier 200 TDY, the 300 TDI is a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder turbo diesel fitted to the Defender, Discovery 1, and the late Range Rover Classic, right up until the TD5 replaced it in 1998. It stayed in production for export markets after that, and its larger 2.8-liter derivative kept working in Ford trucks built in Brazil until 2010, which tells you how much manufacturers trusted the core design. Output is modest, around 111 horsepower and 195 pound-feet of torque. Nobody buys a 300 TDI for speed. They buy it because there is almost nothing left inside it that can go wrong on its own. The entire engine is built around mechanical simplicity. Fuel delivery comes from a purely mechanical Bosch VE rotary injection pump with no engine control unit involved at all. There is no electronic throttle, no sensor network, nothing that a failed relay can knock out in the middle of nowhere. The block is cast iron. The internals are conservatively stressed given the low power output, and the whole design meets Euro 2 and later Euro 3 emissions standards without a single electronic system to get there. Every extra sensor and connector on a modern engine is one more thing that can fail from vibration or water ingress, and every one of those failures tends to happen without warning at the worst possible moment. This one simply has fewer of them to begin with. That is not an accident. It is the entire reason specialists call it the most reliable engine Land Rover ever produced. With that many failure points removed, the one habit that remains matters even more. Specialists document 300 TDI engines running well past 200,000 miles as a matter of routine, many reaching past 300,000 miles before ever needing a major rebuild, and some workshops report original engines running past 310,000 miles on the original internals with consistent care. It is common enough in expedition circles that the chassis and bodywork need full restoration long before the engine asks for attention, to the point where swapping a tired body onto a still healthy 300 TDI drivetrain paired with the equally tough R380 gearbox most of these came with is a recognized way to keep these trucks running for decades. It is also one of the most commonly chosen engines for owners retrofitting older series Land Rovers that started life with far weaker petrol engines. Early production units did suffer a well-documented timing belt alignment fault that could cause catastrophic damage if the belt slipped. Land Rover issued an official repair kit, part numbers STC4095K and STC4096K, depending on VI, and the overwhelming majority of surviving vehicles had this fitted years ago. So today it is mostly a pre-purchase check rather than a live risk. What has not changed is the habit that replaced it. Replace the timing belt roughly every 60,000 miles without exception, and adjust the valve clearances at the same service. Skip that one habit for even a single interval on a vehicle with genuinely heavy use, and you are gambling with the one component that can take the whole engine down at once. Past that, the cooling system rule stays constant across every one of these engines. Head gasket problems can surface around the 150,000 mile mark, specifically in engines that have run low on coolant at some point. Turbocharger bearing wear shows up past 200,000 miles too, and oil seepage around the head is common with age, but specialists treat both as cosmetic rather than serious as long as the one habit holds. Check the coolant and do not stretch the intervals. Support for the 300 TDI remains remarkably strong given it left Defender and Discovery production in 2006. Complete rebuild kits, reconditioned units, and technical documentation are all readily available through specialists who still work on these engines daily. Compare that to what came after in the wider diesel world. Particulate filters that clog on short journeys, EGR systems caked with carbon, injectors that individually cost more than a used 300 TDI engine. None of that exists here. There is nothing to regenerate and nothing that needs a laptop to diagnose. The 300 TDI proves that removing complexity removes most of the risk, but the engine with the strongest case on this entire list is not a diesel at all, and it has had 40 years for owners to learn its one habit. Most still have not. Number 1, the Rover Viv 8, the engine every other one on this list is still being measured against. This is the engine most buyers write off before they even look at it properly. Dismissed as too old, too simple, too far removed from anything modern to be worth the search. That dismissal is exactly backwards. Measured purely on decades of proven service, nothing else here comes close, and arguably nothing else in Land Rover's history does either. The Rover Vive 8 is an all-aluminum pushrod overhead valve Vive 8, originally derived from a Buick design that Rover acquired the rights to in the 1960s. Land Rover and Rover Group kept building it in one form or another from 1967 all the way through 2005, 38 years of continuous production, longer than most car manufacturers exist at all. Displacement grew over that span from the original 3.5 liters through 3.9, 4.0, and 4.6 liters, later spawning supercharged descendants at 4.2 and 5.0 liters, and it powered the Range Rover Classic, Discovery 1 and 2, the Defender, and the Range Rover P38. It is arguably the single engine most responsible for defining what a Land Rover actually is. Early versions ran through SU or Zenith carburetors before Lucas electronic fuel injection took over, and later the GEMS and Bosch engine management systems used into the late 1990s. But notice what stayed constant underneath all of that: the core mechanical layout. Every generation of improvement was bolted onto the outside of the engine instead of demanding the internals work harder. Even the compression ratio tells the same story. In some markets, it was deliberately kept low enough to run on lower octane fuel, a small, unglamorous decision that says everything about an engine built to be kept running anywhere, rather than to impress anyone on a spec sheet. Its durability comes from restraint, not sophistication. 2 valves per cylinder, a simple pushrod valve train, low compression by modern standards, and nothing resembling the thermal stress that later turbocharged or supercharged engines place on their internals. When Land Rover revised the design for the P38 Range Rover and Discovery 2 in the 1990s, they went further: larger main bearings, a stronger crankshaft, a stiffer block with extra ribbing, cross-bolted main bearing caps, and a relocated oil pump no longer driven off the camshaft. There is very little inside this engine that can catastrophically fail if it is looked after. I have seen the ownership records for this one, and they are hard to argue with. A documented 1995 model example reached 270,000 miles on its original engine, still running when it was written up. Owner forums describe a 3.5 liter example that passed 450,000 miles before the rest of the vehicle, not the engine, was finally retired. The consensus among specialists who have serviced these for decades is straightforward. Looked after correctly, a Rover V8 comfortably clears 300,000 miles without major internal work, and it is usually everything bolted around the engine, air suspension, electronics, trim that gives up first, especially on the more complex P38 models. And here's the one habit that decides everything for this engine specifically. Early 3.9 liter versions built between 1989 and 1992 had a real head gasket weakness from thermal stress in the original wet liner block, resolved by multi multi-layer steel gasket revisions from 1993 onward. But the habit that matters across the entire 38-year run is oil discipline. The flat tappet camshaft and lifter design depends on consistent lubrication to avoid scuffing, and camshaft wear shows up almost exclusively in engines that went too long between oil changes. Keep the interval short, use the correct oil, warm the engine properly before demanding power from it, and this becomes a non-issue rather than a certainty. Skip that one habit and it is the first thing to go, regardless of how well everything else was maintained. It is a strikingly cheap habit to keep for what it protects. A full oil and filter change costs a fraction of what a top-end rebuild does, and the engines that cross 300,000 miles are, almost without exception, the ones where that math was never questioned. Parts and specialist knowledge remain exceptional for an engine this old, precisely because of how long it stayed in production and how widely it was used. Independent remanufacturers, including specialists in the UK, continue building complete units to this day, long after Land Rover itself stopped in 2005. That is not something you can say about most 38-year-old engine designs, and it is a large part of why this engine remains genuinely usable rather than a museum piece.